For whatever reason, the Temple of Apphia has multiple sets of pediment sculpture that were made fairly close together. But what's really interesting is that just in the 15-20 years between their making, there's this really big shift in style. And we're going to compare two dying warriors. I've creatively called them Dying Warrior 1 and Dying Warrior 2. This is the slightly earlier one, who dates to about 500 to 490 BCE. You can see that he filled that sort of awkward corner in the pediment. And this one really is firmly archaic. You can see the sort of stiff rigidity. He's in a fairly complicated pose, but if you compare him to a Kouros, he's got those locked knees, he's got that really stiff pose. Basically, all his muscles are flexed at once, that you can sort of see in the Kouros as well, right? There's that stiffness to his muscles. His face is very archaic. And I haven't actually mentioned this before, which is a great oversight of mine. But if you go back and look at the faces of all of our archaic figures, you will notice the archaic smile. Do you notice that big smile on his face? You will see that archaic smile on all of the other sculptures as well. It is an absolutely distinct trait of the archaic period. They all have that serene, very noticeable smirk. What else is very archaic here? His hair, right? That elaborate, very geometric, very artificial looking almost, ringlet hairstyle and braids down his back. He's still got those very Egyptian proportions, doesn't he? Those very stiff, very square shoulders. He does have quite nice anatomy if you compare him to Croesus, say, right? The artist who carved this definitely appreciated human anatomy. Like if you look at the ribs, if you look at the muscles in his arm, around his hips, the calf muscles are quite nicely done. You get the impression that the artist who carved this knows what human muscles look like. The ribs are really nicely done. So definitely appreciation for human anatomy. It's in the heroic nude. He did originally have a penis that was actually removed by the museum. Some light censorship. You can see the little holes on his shoulder. He probably had some kind of accessory, maybe some kind of armor. You can see where the elbow is missing. That is because there was some damage to the piece. Now, notice what he is doing. He is called the Dying Warrior. That piece of metal in his chest is an arrowhead or a spearhead that he is actually trying to pull out. So he has actually been severely wounded. He has fallen, and he is trying to remove that projectile. And you can see it's gone in very deep, and it's in a very delicate part of the chest. You can tell that it would have done tremendous damage. Yet he has that big smile. To us modern viewers, that big smile, and he does seem to have a somewhat relaxed pose, doesn't he? He seems to just be sort of floating or lounging. His legs are just sort of crossed. What has happened to him and what he's doing and his facial expression to us modern viewers doesn't quite match. However, if you take a step back, put yourself in the shoes of an archaic Greek, he's in the heroic nude, right? Greeks didn't actually go into battle naked, of course. He is also a mythological figure. What is the heroic nude telling us about him? Do you remember? What is the shorthand message of the heroic nude? The name basically tells us, right? It tells us that he's dutiful. Now, he is a mythological Greek from the mythological Bronze Age, but of course that whole message of the dutiful individual would be encoded here, right? He is a hero. He has that big smile on his face, that archaic smile on his face, because he is dying a hero's death. He is doing his duty. He does not fear death. It is a hero's reaction. Do you see what's going on here? So while to us modern viewers at first this isn't incongruous, the message is actually very clear and very easy to read. It's not naturalistic, but from an iconography point of view, from sending a message point of view, the smile and the action are actually very clear. This is a hero, a dutiful hero. This is a person with a very strong, very disciplined mind, a very strong physical body, who does not fear death, who sees it as his duty, who is dying as a hero. So this is very much still an archaic sculpture. So although some of the anatomy is executed very beautifully, the body is still in that very much sort of stiff, all muscle flexed way of composition. The body is not really behaving the way a human body would. It's very much iconography oriented, very much message oriented. Now let's have a look at Dying Warrior 2 from the same temple that was made within maybe 10-15 years of this sculpture. So it was made very, very closely to it time-wise. And here is Dying Warrior 2, also from the Temple of Apphia. He was probably made only 10-15 years apart from the piece we were just looking at. This one is right from the tail end of the Archaic. And I think you can see that there's been a switch. The style has changed. Now, just to point out, the leg there would have originally connected. That piece has broken, so you can tell that this sculpture had broken into pieces and has been repaired. So a few sort of superficial things. He's slightly older. You can tell he has a beard, so he's from a slightly different age category. He's got a slightly heavier body type as well. His helmet is carved from marble, and he's got a shield. That, can you tell just from looking at him, what has changed? Most people notice the facial expression. The archaic smile has gone. He's got a more sort of situation appropriate, I guess you could say, expression. He looks focused and maybe a bit tired. He's got sort of a groove in his nose. His mouth is maybe slightly open, as if breathing is a little harder. Do you notice too that his pose makes a little more sense? He doesn't just sort of seem to be lounging at a beach. You get the sense of the tilt of his body. Do you notice his hip, his back hip? He seems to be sort of trying to rotate. Now look at his upper arms and the wrist, especially of the arm closer to us, and also the arm that's holding the shield. Can you see the sinews in his forearm, the tension in his wrist? And can you see the upper arm with the shield, how it's bulging? Can you see that? His arms are behaving the way a weight-bearing human arm would. You can see the muscles bulging under the effort of pushing up his weight. You can see the tension in his wrist and tendons as he's putting weight on that arm to put weight on his arms as he's rolling over to get back up. Do you see that same kind of tension in his legs? Do you see how his knee is sort of softened but also flexing? Do you see the same thing in his ankles? No longer are all his muscles tensed at once like you see in a typical archaic sculpture. Our sculptor here for Dying Warrior 2 has done something really quite radical. They have carved this piece of stone to not just look like a human body, but to behave like a human body. Let that sink in for a moment. We've seen some Egyptian sculptures that were carved really beautifully to look anatomically quite correct, that they didn't really behave the way human muscles do. The same with these Greek pieces we've been looking at so far. This one, the muscles, the tendons, you can actually see some veins in his feet. This lump of stone has been carved to behave like a human body. The stone has been turned to flesh. This is a completely new approach to art. And the Greeks really are an outlier with their embrace of naturalism and their interest in making their art not just look like humans, but behave like humans. Naturalism in art is fairly rare. Most human civilizations prefer the more archaic, more iconography, more message-oriented approach. There are actually fairly few cultures that go for the full-blown naturalism. The Greeks are one, the Ile-Ife culture in Africa are another, then there's the Romans, and then the Maya in Central America also really embrace a certain degree of naturalism as well. And then we see it reappear in the Renaissance too. So this is actually really quite special and really quite unusual. So we still count this sculpture as archaic. There's a couple of sort of minor reasons why. We'd have to go into quite a bit of detail. If this were a Greek art class, I would explain to you exactly why this one still counts as archaic. It's really right on the cusp of why. It's sort of still splitting hairs. You can see the dates here too. 480 is when the classical period starts, but you can really see that shift. And of course, the question is, why? Why do we shift from the more stiff, archaic, to this really quite striking naturalism? The full-blown honest answer is that we don't really know why this happened, but we think it might have to do with painting, specifically ceramic painting. So let's talk a little bit about Greek ceramic painting, specifically a type that was very popular in Athens. So follow me to the next slide. Most Greek city-states had some kind of decorated ceramic industry. Corinth was very famous for it and had one of the earliest ceramic industries. Athens was also very famous for it. That giant crater that I had the slide up for you right at the beginning of the lecture was from Athens. Now, these two-color ceramics, you'll notice that it's orange and black, are made using a special firing technique. Black figure ceramics, the figures are done in black, and then red figure, the next slide will give you an example, the figures are done in the red. So no trick question there, it just describes the color in which the figures are done. But let me explain to you how the decoration is done. So the natural color of the clay is that orangey red that you can see. If you made a pot out of the natural clay of Athens and just put it in a kiln, it would come out in that natural orangey red. But very, very early on, Athenian potters realized that if you water down the clay and create something called a slip, so you water down that clay to make a very, very fine-grained, almost like a paint, that's what the slip is. and then you paint that slip onto your pot and fire it in a kiln, you'll have a really interesting process happen in which the parts that you painted with the slip turn that shiny black. You actually have to use a 3-part firing process in your kiln as well. It's actually a really difficult technique to get that perfect shiny black. So you have to use a first phase where you have all your kiln vents open. You then have to close your kiln vents and deprive the kiln of oxygen. That dries up the heat. The slip will actually turn to glass, which seals off the surface. And then in the third phase, you will open those vents again, and all the parts that weren't treated with the slip will turn red again. But the parts that were treated with the slip, the surface is closed, so sealed off, no more oxygen can get in, so they stay that shiny black. So it's a really sophisticated technique. And through trial and error, the Athenians were able to perfect this technique. So to make a piece like this one, you would apply slip to everything you wanted to be black. And the 2 figures here, for example, you can see they have sort of an archaic style to them. They're fairly stiff, they're somewhat simple. The figures originally would have been applied in this slip, and they would have been completely silhouette. All those beautiful details that you see on them now would not have been applied yet. Then you would have put your pot into the kiln. It would have gone through the 3-stage firing process. And when you took it out, you would have had your 2 figures completely in silhouette. They would have just been black shadows at this point. And then your artist, in this case, we know his name. His name was Exekius because he actually signed this piece. Exekius had to take a tool, imagine like a very sharp needle, and he had to very carefully scratch those details into his figures so that the orange would shine through again. Look at those perfect spirals. Look at the incredible details in the textiles that they are wearing. Exekius was about as good as it gets in the black figure technique. So it was a very demanding, difficult technique. Just sort of the difficulty of adding detail back to your silhouette figures means that you had to sort of limit how much detail, how much anatomical detail, for example, you were able to add to your figures. Imagine if your hand slipped, you would basically chip off that shiny glaze. Now these vases, they're often just referred to as vases, like this one you're looking at right here. A crater was used for mixing wine and water during drinking parties, all male drinking parties, in which a guy would invite all his friends over to his house. If women were present, they were professionals, if you get my gist. So the women of the family were not invited. And the goal of these drinking parties, they were called symposium, was to get drunk, but in as witty and sophisticated a fashion as possible. So you would pass around these big drinking cups and you would tell jokes and stories and philosophize and play games. So this particular piece, it would have been expensive, especially when signed by an artist like Exekius, but most people would have been able to afford 1 or 2 pieces like this at the very least. But they were also status symbols and they were luxury items. A lot of these were actually exported to Italy. The people that lived in Italy at this time, so this is before the Romans became powerful. The people in charge at the time were called the Etruscans. They really liked these black and red figure ceramics. So a lot of these were exported too. And people who could afford really fancy ones actually collected them, and there were a lot of workshops that made these, and they were sought after collector's items. So These are basically the fancy Sunday dishes, but certain artists were really sought after, and there were different workshops that were competing for customers. So the different workshops and artists that worked for them were always competing with each other to come up with novel ideas so they could sell and export more of these interesting works. And presumably the artists themselves were really interested in pushing boundaries too. And we actually see that there's a new invention, a new style of these, and that is the red figure. And the red figure technique allowed for more freedom in decoration. And let's go to the next slide and look at a red figure piece, and you'll see what I mean. The basic technique for making a red figure piece is basically the same, so the same kiln process. The only difference is, in black figure, you paint your little figures on in the slip, and then you have to scratch the slip away again. In red figure, you basically paint everything except your figures with the black slip. So in this particular piece that we're looking at, it was painted by Euphronius. So again, he signed it. So for his figures, he left his figures blank. So he left them in the original orange background, and then he painted everything around them with the black slip. But what he can do now is he can paint all the details with a paintbrush in the black slip before the piece is even fired. So look at all the more detail that he can put in here. This is another scene from the Trojan War. The figure in the center is Hermes, the god Hermes. The dead warrior that is being picked up, his name is Sarpedon, and those are his half-brothers, Sleep and Death, that are picking him up to take him back to his family. Look at the details in the feathers, look at the details in the clothing, look at Sarpedon's muscles. Do you notice how much more anatomy there is? And you can actually see that Euphronius has tried to put some 3D effects in here too. He's used foreshortening in Sarpedon's legs, so the legs sort of retreat into the background of the piece. You can really see the limpness in Sarpedon's body, whereas the other piece by Ezekias, it was much more rigid. They were a little bit more like shadow puppets, weren't they? And if you look at the date, you'll notice that this more naturalistic style, bodies behaving like bodies, shows up earlier in the vase painting than it does in sculpture. And we know the Greeks painted. They painted very beautiful paintings, but they painted on wood and linen and that kind of thing, which largely doesn't survive, of course. So the ceramics are the best we have to go on. And we wonder if maybe this taste for the more naturalistic, for bodies behaving for bodies, if maybe that started with competing ceramics painters who were pushing innovation because they were trying to keep customers interested. If maybe that is what drove the innovation. And if you compare this piece to the black figure piece, you can really see the freedom and the sort of the ease of detail and experimentation that the red figure offers that the black figure just doesn't. Red figure makes it much easier to add detail. And interestingly enough, the earliest examples of red figure that we know of have the same picture on them. One side is red figure and the other side is the same picture in black figure. So the next slide is the two pieces side by side so you can compare them. And then the very last slide that I have for you is a red figure vase showing you how a pottery workshop like this would have worked. So I'll meet you at the last slide, and that will then finish out the Archaic period. This is a rather delightful piece because it's unusual for a couple of reasons. For one, it shows us a pottery workshop, and it shows us the different painters that would have worked on a piece like this assembly line style. You may have noticed when you were looking at the pieces that we have the black parts that are done completely in the glossy black. We have the main decoration with all the beautiful figures. And then you might have noticed that we have the bands of the really beautiful geometric secondary decoration. Different people decorated different parts of the ceramics. And this pottery workshop shows us this on this particular piece. If you look in the right-hand corner, we actually have a woman working on a pot. So ancient Greek texts, especially ones from Athens, very rarely mention working women, but of course women worked. Upper class women didn't have to, but everyday women, of course, went to work and ran all sorts of businesses. So here we have a woman working in a pottery workshop, and then we have 3 other pottery workers. And depending on their size and their chairs, you can tell they have more or less prestigious jobs and decorate more or less prestigious parts of the pots. You can see the guy on the fanciest chairs who has the biggest position, who's the biggest one as well. He would be our figure painter. He is the one who paints the big figures. And we have some supernatural visitors in this pottery workshop as well. The biggest figure of all of them is Athena. You can recognize her by her helmet and her long spear, and she's also wearing a long dress. So whenever you see a warrior in a long dress, that's Athena. And the 2 winged women are the goddess of victory, also known as Nike, like the shoe brand. That's where the shoe brand gets its name. And they are actually handing out prizes to the various members of this pottery workshop. So whoever owned this particular pottery workshop probably made this as a little piece of advertising. Look at my fine wares, even Athena approves.